On the evening of March 23, 1945, Oberst Wilhelm Steinberg positioned himself along the western bank of the Rhine River near Wesel, Germany. Through his trembling binoculars, he surveyed the darkening waters that had protected German soil for over 2 millennia. His field notebook, later discovered among captured Wehrmacht documents, contained observations that would prove tragically prophetic. The Americans have reached our sacred river, but they cannot cross. No army has ever forced the Rhine against determined German resistance without bridges. What Steinberg witnessed that night would shatter not only German defensive doctrine, but the very assumptions underlying river warfare itself. Artillery flashes illuminated the western bank as thousands of Allied guns prepared for what German commanders expected would be a traditional river assault, one requiring days of preparation, vulnerable bridging operations, and fixed crossing points their 8 AWM's guns could systematically destroy. The Rhine had served as Germany's natural fortress since Roman times. Even with the Reich crumbling from both east and west, military engineers assured their commanders that the river's 300-foot width and swift currents made crossing impossible without lengthy engineering preparations. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong they were. 2,000 men of the 51st Highland Division's 7th Battalion, Black Watch, prepared to enter the water that night. But they would not cross in vulnerable assault boats shuttling back and forth under fire, nor would they wait for engineers to complete pontoon bridges under artillery bombardment. Instead, they would board vehicles that German intelligence had failed to properly assess. Strange boat-shaped trucks designated DUKW. These amphibious vehicles had been observed in Normandy and Italy, but Wehrmacht analysts dismissed them as specialized landing craft irrelevant to river warfare. The mathematics of Rhine defense were about to be shattered not by superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but by American industrial ingenuity that German defenders never imagined could be brought to bear on their last natural fortress. The collapse had begun months earlier in German intelligence assessments. Oberst Gu Enther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would later testify to Allied interrogators about the Wehrmacht's fundamental misreading of American amphibious capabilities. Intelligence reports from Sicily, Salerno, and Normandy had described Schwimmwagen, swimming trucks, but German analysts filed these among the curiosities of American excess, like ice cream ships and cola battalions. Among the defenders was Major Hans-Georg Model, son of Field Marshal Walter Model, serving with the 1st Parachute Army. His personal diary, captured after his surrender in April 1945, would provide historians insight into German assumptions about Rhine defense. The Wehrmacht's most experienced officers, men who had studied river crossings from the Dnieper to the Seine, believed they understood the immutable laws of amphibious assault attackers needed overwhelming artillery superiority, specialized bridging equipment, and most critically, time to establish crossing points that defenders could target. The first revelation of German ignorance came in assessment documents discovered at captured headquarters. Hauptmann Friedrich Wenzel, an intelligence officer with the 15th Army, had compiled reports on Allied equipment that mentioned the DUKW exactly 3 times in 6 months of documentation. Each reference dismissed them as coastal operations equipment with no relevance to river warfare. The reports estimated American forces possessed perhaps 50 to 100 such vehicles in the entire European theater. The reality was staggering. By March 1945, over 2,000 DUKWs operated in the European theater. The U.S. Army had organized them into specialized amphibious truck companies, each with 50 vehicles and trained crews. These units had practiced river crossing operations since Normandy, developing doctrine that German intelligence never detected. The British had received 2,000 DUKWs through Lend-Lease, adding their own operational innovations. Canadian forces operated 800 units with specialized cold weather modifications. The DUKW's development represented American problem, solving at its most efficient. In April 1942, when a Coast Guard patrol boat ran aground on a sandbar near Provincetown, Massachusetts, conventional trucks couldn't reach it through surf and sand. This minor incident sparked a revolution in amphibious warfare that would ultimately help destroy the Third Reich. Palmer Koslet Putnam, working for the Office of Scientific Research and Development, partnered with yacht designer Rod Stevens Jr. and engineer Dennis Puliston to envision a truck that could transition seamlessly from water to land. When Ford Motor Company declined the project, claiming it was impossible to complete in the required timeframe, General Motors Corporation accepted the challenge on April 23, 1942. The engineering team at GMC's Yellow Truck and Coach Manufacturing Company in Pontiac, Michigan, worked around the clock. By June 2, just 38 days later, the first prototype rolled out. The vehicle combined a standard GMC DUKW ton truck chassis with a watertight hull designed by Sparkman and Stevens yacht architects. The designation DUKW came from GMC's nomenclature system D for 1942 design year, U for utility, K for all-wheel drive, and W for dual rear axles. The secret to the DUKW's versatility lay in several innovations. Frank Spare from GMC's engineering team developed the Central Tire Inflation System (CTIs), the world's first such system, allowing drivers to adjust tire pressure while moving. At 10-12 pounds per square inch, the tires spread wide for sand and mud traction. At 40-45 psi, they provided highway efficiency. A 25-inch propeller driven through a transfer case from the main transmission provided water propulsion at 5.5 knots, while a rudder linked to the steering wheel allowed seamless transition from water to land navigation. Major General Jacob Devers observed the first demonstration in June 1942 and immediately ordered mass production. The initial contract called for 2,000 units. By war's end, GMC had manufactured 2,147 DUKWs at the unprecedented pace of 525 per month during peak production, each costing $10,750, roughly the price of 7 Jeeps, but with capabilities that would prove priceless. March 1945 found Germany's Rhine defenses in a state Wehrmacht commanders refused to acknowledge even to themselves. General Alfred Schlemm's 1st Parachute Army, the most effective German force remaining in the West, had been bled white in the Reichswald battles, losing 90,000 men killed, wounded or captured. The reinforcements arriving to defend the Rhine were Volkssturm units, old men and boys with a few weeks' training, armed with captured weapons and wearing armbands instead of uniforms. Feldwebel Otto Cross of the 181st Infantry Division, positioned near Wesel, wrote in a letter to his wife dated March 20th. "The Americans are across from us now, thousands of them. We can hear their vehicles day and night. But the Rhine protects us. Even Napoleon could not cross the Rhine against opposition. The engineers have destroyed every bridge, and our artillery has every possible crossing point registered." The defensive preparations appeared formidable on paper. Since September 1944, over 200 Zalozan civilian laborers had been conscripted to strengthen the West Wall fortifications and extend them toward the Rhine. 3,000 concrete bunkers and gun positions had been constructed or reinforced. The river itself provided what German Doctrine called the perfect water obstacle. Too wide for assault bridges, too swift for boats, too deep for fording. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had assumed command in the West after von Rundstedt's dismissal, issued orders that revealed German assumptions. The enemy will require 48-72 hours to establish viable bridgeheads after initial crossings. This window provides opportunity for counterattack with our mobile reserves. These mobile reserves consisted of XLV Key Panzer Corps with approximately 5 operational armored vehicles, tanks, assault guns, and tank destroyers combined, to cover a front of nearly 200 miles. But the most critical German failure was conceptual. Wehrmacht doctrine, refined through 5 years of war, understood river crossings as sequential operations, suppress defenders with artillery, send infantry across in assault boats, establish small bridgeheads, begin bridge construction under fire, reinforce gradually as bridges were completed, then finally send armor across. Each phase provided defenders opportunities to concentrate fire and launch counterattacks. Unknown to German intelligence, Allied forces had assembled the largest concentration of amphibious vehicles in history along the Rhine's western bank. By March 22, 1945, hundreds of DUKWs had been positioned in concealed areas within 5 miles of planned crossing points. Each vehicle had been waterproofed, mechanically inspected, and loaded with specific cargo manifests that would maintain their water stability. Lieutenant Colonel William Thompson, commanding the 458th Amphibious Truck Company, recalled the meticulous preparation. "We knew this wasn't Normandy with tides and beach obstacles. The Rhine was about current, about exit points, about coordinating with artillery so we didn't get hit by our own shells. We practiced on the Rhine River for 2 weeks, learning how the DUKWs handled in fast current. The vehicles themselves had been modified based on 3 years of combat experience. Armor plating protected drivers and vital mechanical components. Ring mounts for .50 caliber machine guns provided self-defense capability. Most critically, specialized bilge pumps could handle water intake from small arms fire, allowing DUKWs to continue operating even when their hulls were perforated." Captain James Mitchell of the 819th Amphibious Truck Company described the final briefing. "They told us we were going to do something nobody had ever done, use DUKWs as the primary assault vehicle for a major river crossing. Not support vessels, not supply carriers after the bridges were built, but the actual spearhead. Each duck would carry a full rifle squad with equipment, cross the Rhine, drive up the eastern bank, and deposit troops directly into combat positions." At 1700 hours on March 23, 1945, the greatest artillery bombardment of the Rhine campaign commenced. Over 4,000 Allied guns, from 25-pounders to 249 howitzers, unleashed a 4-hour barrage that seemed to turn the air itself into a solid wall of steel and explosive. German observers reported that the eastern bank appeared to be boiling under the impact of thousands of shells per minute. Gefreiter Heinrich M. Müller, manning an observation post near Wesel, attempted to count the muzzle flashes across the river. "I stopped at 500. It was like looking at a solid line of flame stretching north and south as far as I could see. The noise was beyond description. Not individual explosions, but one continuous roar that made thought impossible." Under cover of this bombardment and darkness, the first DUKWs entered the Rhine at 2000 hours. The 51st Highland Division led the assault, with the 7th Battalion Black Watch loaded into DUKWs operated by American crews. Each vehicle carried 12 fully equipped soldiers, plus its 2-man crew. Navigation lights, shielded to be visible only from behind, marked entry and exit points on both banks. Sergeant Robert Macpherson of the Black Watch described the crossing. "We rolled down the bank, and suddenly we were floating. The American driver just kept driving like we were still on land, except now water was rushing past. The engine noise was terrific, and we could hear German shells hitting the water around us, but we couldn't see anything in the darkness and smoke. The current proved stronger than expected. 8 to 10 knots in the main channel. DUKWs launched upstream of their intended landing points, their drivers calculating drift like navigators plotting aircraft courses in crosswinds. Some vehicles were swept hundreds of yards downstream, but their ability to drive up any reasonably sloped bank meant they could exit the river wherever they found themselves. By 200 hours, the first wave was across. German defenders, expecting to hear assault boats returning for second waves, instead heard only the continued roar of artillery. The DUKWs had driven straight up the eastern banks and disappeared into the darkness, their passengers already engaging German positions from unexpected directions. As dawn broke on March 24th, German commanders began receiving reports that defied explanation. Enemy troops were appearing miles inland, from crossing points in battalion strength with heavy weapons and supplies. The expected pattern of gradually expanding bridgeheads hadn't materialized. Instead, Allied forces seemed to be everywhere at once. Hauptmann Karl Richter, commanding a battery of 80 DUKW guns positioned to cover the crossing site at Ries, reported to divisional headquarters. "Enemy armor is behind us." Repeat, "Enemy armor is behind our position." How did they get across? "All bridges are destroyed. We have seen no pontoon construction." What Richter had encountered weren't tanks, but DUKWs carrying infantry support weapons, mortars, machine guns, and anti-tank guns that had driven directly from the Rhine to positions 3 miles inland. The vehicle's amphibious capability allowed them to bypass German strongpoints, positioned to defend obvious routes from the riverbank. The scale of the operation became apparent as morning fog lifted. Hundreds of DUKWs were shuttling across the Rhine in continuous streams. Unlike assault boats that required engineer crews and were limited to perpendicular crossings at prepared sites, DUKWs could enter and exit the river anywhere banks permitted. German artillery observers reported swimming trucks crossing at dozens of 2-mile front. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, operations officer for the 185th Division, recorded in his war diary, "The enemy has deployed a type of amphibious vehicle in numbers we never anticipated. Our defensive plan assumed 6 to 8 crossing points we could target with concentrated fire. Instead, they are crossing everywhere. Our guns cannot engage so many targets simultaneously." At 1,000 hours on March 24th, the thunder of aircraft engines added to the battle's cacophony. Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation in history, began as a massive air armada appeared over the Rhine. The operation involved more than 700 transport aircraft and over 350 gliders carrying 16 Zavos and paratroopers and glider troops. This wasn't the isolated paratrooper drop German Doctrine expected, but a coordinated hammer blow designed to work with the amphibious assault. Oberstfreiter Franz Weber of the 84th Infantry Division watched from his position near Hamminkels. The sky turned black with aircraft. Parachutes bloomed like flowers, thousands upon thousands. We thought this was the main assault, that the river crossings were diversions. Then we learned the Americans were already 10 kilometers behind us with their swimming trucks. The coordination between airborne and amphibious forces multiplied their effectiveness. DUKWs carrying ammunition and medical supplies drove directly to airborne positions that in previous operations would have required air supply or link up with ground forces. Days later, wounded paratroopers were evacuated in DUKWs returning to the Western Bank. Something impossible in traditional airborne operations. Private First Class Donald Burgett of the 17th Airborne later wrote, "We were fighting for this crossroads when these weird-looking truck boats came driving up. No splashing, no bogging down. They just drove out of the woods like regular trucks, except we knew they'd just crossed the Rhine." The crew chief yelled, "Anybody need ammo?" We thought we were hallucinating. By noon on March 24th, the full implications of the DUKW assault became clear to German commanders. This wasn't just a new way to cross rivers. It was a complete revolution in amphibious logistics that invalidated every assumption in their defensive planning. Traditional river crossings required sequential phases: assault crossing, bridgehead consolidation, bridge construction, and finally supply buildup. Each phase was vulnerable to counterattack. Bridges, once built, became critical choke points that concentrated targets for artillery and air attack. The DUKWs eliminated these vulnerabilities. Lieutenant Colonel George Sims, logistics officer for the XVI Corps, had established what he called DUKW highways across the Rhine. Vehicles loaded on the western bank with ammunition, food, medical supplies, and fuel simply drove into the river, crossed, and delivered directly to combat units. No unloading at the riverbank, no transfer to different vehicles, no waiting for bridges. We were running 50 DUKWs per hour at our crossing point, Sims reported. Each carried 2.5 tons of supplies or 25 men. That's 125 tons of supplies or fund 250 troops every hour around the clock. The Germans kept looking for bridges to bomb, but there weren't any. Just trucks driving through water. The psychological impact on German defenders was devastating. Feldwebel Hermann Goethe, Tos of the 2nd Parachute Regiment, wrote in his diary, "They have unlimited vehicles that swim. How do you stop an army that can turn any river into a road? We blow up bridges for nothing. They don't need bridges." Supply sergeants reported surreal experiences. Technical Sergeant Anthony Russo of the 30th Infantry Division described establishing a supply dumpy. "We're 3 miles from the Rhine on the German side, right? And here comes a DUKW straight from the water, dripping wet, carrying hot food in insulated containers. The cooks on the western bank had prepared the meal, loaded it in the duck, and it drove straight to us. Hot coffee in the middle of a battle. The Germans must have thought we were insane." March 25th dawned with German commanders facing a situation Wehrmacht doctrine had never addressed. The Rhine, Germany's historic barrier, had become irrelevant, not conquered, not breached, but simply bypassed by American industrial ingenuity that German intelligence had dismissed as a curiosity. General Alfred Schlemm, commanding the 1st Parachute Army, held a commanders' conference that morning in a farmhouse near Braunen. The surviving record of this meeting, compiled from testimonies of captured officers, reveals the depth of German dismay. Schlemm reportedly said, "Gentlemen, we prepared to fight the last war. We assumed the enemy would attack our fortress. Instead, they drove around it. The numbers were staggering. In the first 48 hours, DUKWs had transported over 15,000 troops across the Rhine. More critically, they had moved 200 vehicles, jeeps, trucks, and light armor that traditional crossing methods wouldn't have delivered for days. Artillery pieces were being ferried across and firing from the eastern bank before German intelligence even confirmed the crossings had occurred." The Rhine crossing starkly exposed the industrial asymmetry between American mass production and German craftsmanship philosophy. While German engineers had developed their own amphibious vehicle, the Landwasserschlepper, LWS, the production comparison revealed everything about why Germany lost the war. The LWS was in many ways superior to the DUKW. It could carry 20 men compared to the DUKW's 25, but it had better armor protection. Its tracked design provided superior performance in mud and snow. German engineers had solved complex problems of waterproofing track systems and creating reliable bilge pumps. As a piece of engineering, it was remarkable, but Germany had produced only about 100 units total, with even fewer seeing operational service. The LWS required specialized components, skilled craftsmen for assembly, and rare materials for its armor and waterproofing. Each unit cost approximately 75,000 Reichsmarks, 7 times the cost of a DUKW. Meanwhile, General Motors had produced 20 Fun 147 DUKWs using existing truck components and assembly line methods. The vehicle shared its engine, transmission, axles, and countless other parts with the standard CCKW truck, of which 562 750 were built. This standardization meant any mechanic familiar with military trucks could maintain a DUKW. Spare parts were abundant. Damaged vehicles were quickly repaired or cannibalized. Master Sergeant Edwin Coleman, maintenance chief for the 462nd Amphibious Truck Company, explained the advantage. "We kept 90% of our ducts operational throughout the crossing. When something broke, we had the parts. When we didn't have the parts, we could adapt something from a regular truck. Try doing that with some specialized German wonder weapon." Personal accounts from both sides of the Rhine reveal the human dimension of this technological and tactical revolution. Private First Class James Hall of the 89th Infantry Division recalled his first sight of the DUKWs. We were lined up on the west bank, expecting to crowd into assault boats under fire like we'd trained. Then these things that looked like boats with wheels came rolling down the bank. A Navy guy. Yeah, Navy, in the middle of Germany, waves us aboard. I asked him, "What the hell is this thing?" He grinned and said, "Your taxi to Berlin, soldier." The presence of US Navy personnel operating DUKWs deep in continental Europe added to German confusion. Seaman Second Class Robert Moody, assigned to a naval detachment operating DUKWs for the Rhine crossing, described the German reaction. "We captured some Germans who just stared at our Navy uniforms. One who spoke English kept asking, 'How is the American Navy here? The ocean is 300 miles away.' He simply couldn't process what he was seeing." German accounts reveal progressive demoralization as the scope of American amphibious capability became clear. Lieutenant Friedrich Schulz of the 338th Infantry Division wrote in a letter captured after his unit's surrender, "They came across the river like it was a street. Not sneaking, not rushing between artillery barrages, but driving. Trucks full of soldiers driving through the Rhine. We shot at them, but more kept coming. Always more. Where did they get so many?" Unteroffizier Paul Braun, captured on March 26, told interrogators, "We were told the Rhine would stop you for weeks. That you would have to build bridges we would destroy, that your assault boats would be easy targets for our guns. Nobody told us about swimming trucks. Nobody warned us you could cross anywhere, anytime. We prepared for the wrong war." By March 26, 1945, just 72 hours after the first DUKW entered the Rhine, the German defensive position had completely collapsed. What Wehrmacht Doctrine insisted would take weeks had been accomplished in 3 days. The Rhine barrier, which propaganda claimed would hold until negotiations could save something of the Reich, had evaporated. The statistics from those 3 days revealed the revolution's scope. DUKWs had completed over 5,000 individual crossings. They had transported 15,000 troops, fussed 200 vehicles, 3,000 tons of supplies, and evacuated 2,000 wounded. Traditional bridging operations, had they been required, would have needed 2 weeks to achieve similar throughput while under constant attack. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, often criticized for excessive caution, had achieved complete operational surprise through the mass employment of amphibious vehicles. His after-action report noted, "The enemy expected us to cross the Rhine. They did not expect us to drive across it." The distinction proved fatal to their defense. General Dwight Eisenhower visited the crossing sites on March 26. His reaction, recorded by aide Captain Harry Butcher, was telling. Ike watched the DUKWs streaming back and forth like a ferry service. He turned to Bradley and said, "With these things, every river in Germany is now a highway." Bradley replied, "The Germans are just figuring that out." The psychological collapse was complete. Joseph Goebbels' diary entry for March 26 read, "The situation in the West has become impossible. The enemy has crossed the Rhine along a broad front, with a new type of amphibious vehicle we failed to anticipate. Our last natural barrier is gone. The war is lost." On May 7, 1945, just 6 weeks after the Rhine crossing, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims. Among the factors he cited for Germany's defeat was the enemy's unexpected amphibious capabilities at the Rhine. This admission, buried in longer explanations about strategic bombing and Soviet pressure, revealed the crossing's true impact. General Eisenhower's final report as Supreme Commander allocated significant credit to the DUKW. No single piece of equipment contributed more to the rapid conquest of Germany than the amphibious truck. It turned rivers from obstacles into highways, transformed logistics from limitation into advantage, and shortened the war by weeks, if not months off. The last operational DUKW crossing of the Rhine occurred on May 10, 1945. 2 days after Germany's surrender, It carried not soldiers, but food supplies for German civilians in isolated areas cut off by destroyed bridges. The vehicle that had broken Germany's last military barrier had become an instrument of humanitarian relief. Private First Class Anthony DeMarco, driving that last DUKWs across the Rhine. Record, no shooting, no artillery, just driving across like it was a Sunday cruise. German kids were waiting on the eastern bank, hoping we had chocolate. 4 months earlier, their fathers would have been trying to kill us. Now we were bringing food. That's what those ducks did. Turned the impossible into routine. Enemies into people needing help. The Rhine crossing of March 1945 stands as a watershed moment in military history, not for its tactical brilliance or strategic importance alone, but for what it represented about the changing nature of warfare. The DUKW, ungainly, unarmored, unremarkable, had rendered irrelevant a barrier that had protected Germany for 2 millennia. German defenders, prepared for every contingency their doctrine could imagine, never conceived that American industry could produce over 21 Zahl-Osen vehicles that made rivers irrelevant. They prepared for the wrong war, not through incompetence, but through inability to imagine American productive capacity. The Rhine wasn't conquered, it was industrially obsoleted. The hundreds of DUKWs that crossed the Rhine between March 23 and 31, 1945, carried more than soldiers and supplies. They carried proof that American mass production could transform warfare's fundamental assumptions. Every German soldier who watched a DUKW drive up the Rhine's eastern bank witnessed the death of traditional military limitations. Field Marshal Montgomery summarized the operation with uncharacteristic brevity. We didn't assault the Rhine. We commuted across it. This transformation of the extraordinary into the mundane, the impossible into the routine, was the DUKW's true victory. The Rhine crossing demonstrated that in modern warfare, industrial capacity properly applied could achieve what military genius alone could not. The Wehrmacht, perhaps history's most professionally competent military force, was defeated not by superior strategy or tactics, but by swimming trucks produced on Detroit assembly lines. In the end, the German defenders were correct in their pre-war assessment. The Rhine could not be crossed against determined resistance using traditional methods. They simply never imagined that American industry would make traditional methods obsolete. The DUKWs that swam the Rhine in March 1945 didn't just transport soldiers. They carried the future of warfare, where industrial might would trump geographic advantage, where mass production would defeat craft perfection, where pragmatic innovation would overwhelm rigid doctrine. The Rhine crossing's true lesson was not military, but industrial in the 20th century's total wars. Victory belonged not to the best soldiers, but to the best factories.